this morning, what I want to do, and this will make sense in just a moment. If you're new with us, we are walking through the book of Exodus in 2024. So we've done this a number of times throughout the year, not the book of Exodus, but we've taken one particular book of the Bible and done a deep dive. And this year we're doing the book of Exodus. In case you don't know this, the book of Exodus is kind of a no-brainer, but it's in the Old Testament. So it's the second book of the Bible, second book of the Old Testament. It's an important book. And before we start going this morning, I want to talk about the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So in our Bibles, 2/3 of this thing is covered by the Old Testament. So this is everything predating the life and ministry of Jesus. And then the New Covenant, the New Testament, the final third is the life of Jesus and the explanation. So the Gospels are the life and narrative of Jesus, his ministry, death, resurrection. The epistles and everything that comes after it brings the detail, the explanation of what happened in the Gospels. Now, over the years, especially, I've seen it particularly in the last couple of decades, the Old Testament has kind of taken a beating. And it's by the church and it's by culture. The other night, don't judge me, you guys all have your shows too, right? You guys have shows that you watch unless you're just that person that doesn't watch TV. But Melanie and I will get done with one show and we're like, we got to binge something else. So we're kind of in our 1990s era right now. So we've already done Friends a couple times and we've done ER and now we are on West Wing. So I don't know if you guys have watched West Wing. West Wing is... Of all television I've ever watched in my life, West Wing is the smartest show I've ever watched. Now, politics aside, whatever, it's just really well written. So Aaron Sorkin, is it Sorkinson or Sorkin? He's the one who wrote it. He also wrote ER, and so we watched that. That's what we're binging right now. And I think it was Friday night we watched it with Haley and Joey, her fiance. Just an opportunity to say you have a fiance. Give her the attention she desires. And so in that... She's my daughter and my twin. I know what she wants. And so we're watching this Friday night, and it's an episode. They always deal with a hot topic, and it's interesting to watch these hot topics in the year like 1999 and remembering what was fresh in the 90s. At this point in time, they were talking about capital punishment. This is not a sermon on capital punishment at all, okay? Matter of fact, this isn't a sermon on politics. I'm just using an opening illustration that happened to come from West Wing, and I couldn't believe it because today my opening is all about the importance of the Old Testament. And in this particular episode, if you don't know what West Wing is, it's about the staff that surrounds the president. That's just a nutshell version of the show. So it's the communication staff, the chief of staff, and the president. And in this particular episode, they're dealing with capital punishment. And one of the staff members he's Jewish, and he goes to his temple while this big decision is being made. What are they going to do with capital punishment? And he goes to the temple, and he meets with his rabbi. And the rabbi, I recognized him from other shows. He's a mob man in other shows, and now all of a sudden he's a Jewish rabbi. I'm like, he's very eclectic in his talents. So he's got this, and he's talking to Toby about the Old Testament and about, doesn't the Old Testament say an eye for an eye, and going into this. And the rabbi literally said, we're watching this, and I cringed. I absolutely cringed because the rabbi, the Jewish rabbi in a metropolitan city, playing the part, I understand this as an actor, said, well, that doesn't really apply to us because that doesn't translate into our modern culture. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, it's one thing for a random person on the street to say that this part of Scripture no longer applies to us because this culture, our modern culture, can't handle it. What they're doing in that, and this is something that I've said throughout this series, is they're allowing culture to dictate doctrine instead of doctrine dictating culture. It's backwards. It's totally backwards. And I'm like, wow, can you imagine a Jewish rabbi saying the scriptures don't matter, culture matters? I'm like, so that was terrible writing. So there's a glitch in the writing on this thing. It's just like me coming up and going, you know what, guys? We really don't even need to open the New Testament or any of the Bible today because my interpretation of culture is what matters. So this is what's happened with the Old Testament is we've got this view of the Old Testament that it's incomplete, that it doesn't matter. That without the New Testament, the Old Testament doesn't matter. A matter of fact, and I'm not going to name names here, but a very, very prominent pastor in the country years ago, about 5 years ago, wrote a book and preached an entire series on why the Old Testament is no longer applicable because it's been fulfilled in the New Testament. Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament, so the Old Testament no longer matters, which brings me to your lovely acorn. Everybody pull up your acorn. There's a purpose in this. Is this acorn, ladies and gentlemen, now I know that they have fallen and they're on the ground, but is this acorn in and of itself incomplete? Is it incomplete? My answer to this is no. No, it's not. Because in here, even though one day this acorn could become a beautiful, beautiful, grand oak tree, and the oak tree certainly is much more beautiful in grandeur than this tiny little acorn. Once upon a time, before that oak tree became that oak tree, everything of it was contained inside this acorn, right? There was nothing lacking from this acorn. Everything that it needed was in this acorn. So it was all there. It just hadn't been fully unfolded yet. And I want that to hit. I want you to understand this. There's really nothing in the New Testament that isn't first in the Old Testament in seed form. So think about the Old Testament this way. Think about the New Testament this way. So the New Testament is the Old Testament unfolded. Okay? So Old Testament is the acorn. The New Testament is what becomes of this acorn when it becomes a fully grown oak tree. And I just want you to remember that. So the Old Testament is not incomplete. It's just not fully developed yet. It hasn't turned into what it's supposed to be. So everything you find in the New Testament, once upon a time, lived in the Old Testament. And everything in the Old Testament points us forward to the New Testament. Now, with that said, by the way, this is just nerd notes. It's really not the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So covenant is a much better word for this. So we've got the covenant of the old and we've got the covenant of the new with Christ. Now, what we have been talking about in this series, and if you've been with us long enough, you know that Rob has a mouth that goes a million miles an hour. And I will prepare a sermon weeks ahead of time. And I'm like, I can't wait to get to that. And then when I get to that, I've already mentioned it to you 3 times because I'm impulsive and can't wait. So what was supposed to be developed today is something that I've mentioned to you a number of times over the first 4 weeks. So when I say it, act surprised. You're like, that's good, Rob, okay? Ray would have you practice that. He'd like, let's practice this. We won't do that. Here's something I want you to observe about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we'll throw it on the screen for you. When the New Testament gives us a principle, okay, so the New Testament gives us a principle, the Old Testament gives us a story, right? Think about that. When the New Testament gives us a principle or gives us a doctrine or gives us a definition, the Old Testament describes it in the form of a story. So another way to put this is when the New Testament gives us a concept, the Old Testament gives us an illustration. Okay, and we'll dive into that in just a minute. We'll show you again what that looks like. Now, as I've been going through Exodus, this happened when we went through Revelation as well. And I'm hoping God is having moments like this for you guys when you're studying this, whether it's when I'm preaching it or you're reading these books, these texts when you're at home. There's these moments, I don't know what else to call them other than eureka moments. They're just like, you're just amazed by God. I get it. He's big, he's holy, he's other, he's all, I don't get it, but I try to get it. But he's also a mad genius. Not mad, take the mad part out. He's just genius. And then you read things in Scripture and you're like, oh my goodness. Think about how God has created us. Think about how he's created us. Think about how he's hardwired your brain. In your brain, you have 2 sides to your brain, right? You have the left side of your brain, which is analytical, right? I call it the firstborn syndrome of your brain. The analytical side, where it's going to look and it's going to be micromanaging, it's going to be detail-oriented, it's going to bring order out of chaos, okay? It's a system side of your brain. It's the analytical side. And most of us firstborns, we use that side, right? And we hardly use the other side. All you babies in here that are not firstborns, you're like, I didn't even know I had that in me, okay? But it's there. You have an analytical side that observes everything and tries to bring order out of chaos. The other side of your brain is what? It's the intuitive side. It's the imagination. It's the big picture. It's the artistic side, right? It's the one that sees everything from 30,000 feet. It struggles when you try to work with the details because it sees the big picture. Which one of these sides of our brain is incomplete? Neither. However, when they work together, something beautiful happens. In our lives, we need both the analytical side of our brain and the intuitive side of our brain. We need both. We need the side that breaks things down to a microscopic level and brings order out of chaos, and we also need the side that brings the big picture. And when they work together, it's beautiful. The same, ladies and gentlemen, is true of the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We need both the principle of the New Testament and we need the illustration, the concept, the story of the Old. Think about this, and this is where I've let the cart get ahead of the horse. Is that right? Cart ahead of the horse. I did it backwards, whatever that illustration is. So in this, let's look at three principles from the New Testament and see how they're illustrated in the Old. Number one, let's talk about the doctrine of sin. Okay, we've talked about this a little bit. What is sin? Sin is much more than just, oops, my bad, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done that, right? We've defined sin as basically anything that's in disobedience to God's will, but it's even bigger than that. It's a breaking of covenant. It's not just, I made a mistake. Now, Romans 3:23 says it like this, and you might know this verse, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There's the principle. Every one of us have sinned. We can keep reading. The entire book of Romans is about this. So the doctrine of sin, we've all fallen short of it. We've all broken covenant with God. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. In the Old Testament, where is that first illustrated? We don't have to go very far, right? Remember, we're opening our Bibles, and by page 3, the very image bearers of God, the one that were created to bring him all this glory, by page 3, they're like, not so much. I'd like the glory. In that moment, covenant is broken, sin enters the world, and then the rest of the Bible, the next 2,000 pages are about the redemption story, similar to Exodus, where the first chapter is about the enslavement, and then the next 39 chapters are about the rescue. So this is what's going on. Now, so if we want to see the story played out, we look back at Adam and Eve, and we understand the doctrine of sin. What about faith? Well, Hebrews 11:1 gives us a great definition of faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen or not seen. There's the principle. The story, or how it's illustrated in the Old Testament, goes all the way back to Genesis 15 when we see the story of Abraham, where God comes to him and tests his faith. Now, let's talk about salvation. Ephesians 2:8-9. The doctrine of salvation is defined as, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no man, no person can boast. So this is the doctrine of salvation as a principle, and it's played out in illustration in the very story we're covering this year with the story of Moses. So at the end of the day, the New Testament gives us a principle, and the Old Testament gives us a picture. And the only reason I'm bringing that up today is because now, starting today, we're going to really start unpacking the story of Moses and the Israelites being rescued from Egyptian bondage. And you need to understand, we're not just going through this cool story, this true narrative story. There's a principle involved, and what's happening is Moses, and the way God's working through Moses and Pharaoh in Egypt and Israel, is he's unpacking that principle so we can get a true understanding of what salvation truly looks like. So, to get there, let's remember where we're at in this story. As we finally get to chapter 2 of Exodus, what's happened this far, right? A lot has happened. A lot has happened. And the main thing is we need to realize how they got here. So last week we unpacked this. You can go back and listen to it if you'd like, but once upon a time, I'll do a very short Cliff Note version. Once upon a time, Abraham receives this covenant from God, right? Hey, one day, there are going to be so many descendants of you, Abraham, that they will outnumber the number of stars in the sky. And that was a ridiculous thing for Abraham to believe at the time, wasn't it? For two reasons. Number one, that boy, old, right? He's already getting old. He's up there in years. We just found out today that Gary had a dream last night that Melanie and I are going to adopt 4 children. Ain't happening, okay? It's just not happening. We're not even Abraham old, and that is not happening. Ladies and gentlemen, Melanie's not in here, is she? Pray for my wife. I want a dog. We want a dog so badly. We don't want 4 children. We want a puppy. Pray for your pastor's wife. She's in rebellion, and we need to figure this out. I said what I said. I'm going to get in trouble. All of that to say Abraham gets this covenant. You're going to have all these children, and Abraham's looking around going, where are they? Like, he doesn't even have one at this point, and he's getting old. And if you know the story, eventually he has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has Joseph, okay? So all of a sudden we've got a little bit of a lineage. And by the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, Abraham's descendants, the number that are alive, are about 70 people, or exactly 70 people. One of them, his great-grandson Joseph, years earlier, through a bunch of circumstances that we've already covered, all terrible circumstances, but God's providential hand has guided Joseph to this stage where he's now second in command in the nation of Egypt. And the whole world, the whole known world at this point, has a drought and a famine, and Joseph rescues the whole world, okay? God does through a dream, and all these things happen. And as this drought and famine are happening, all these nations, all these people are coming to Egypt for provision. Because during the drought, or before the drought and before the famine, Joseph had wisely stored up all these resources so the rest of the world would be dependent upon Egypt. Well, of course, all these nations or all these people groups are coming to Egypt for help, and so does Abraham and his family. And so, or not Abraham, I'm sorry, Jacob's family, Joseph's dad. So all of his brothers come and they show up, and now they are living in Egypt. And all of a sudden, in chapter 1, remember this, we take a huge quantum leap. The Bible does that sometimes, where we're once upon a time where here's the story of Joseph, here's the 70 Israelites. Now, one verse later, now there's a new Pharaoh in town. There's a new sheriff in town. There's a new king in town. And it's 400 years after the last one. So the old Pharaoh is dead. Joseph is dead. Joseph's children are dead. Joseph's children's children's children are dead. It's been a long time since Joseph was in the story. And this new Pharaoh doesn't know anything about Joseph and the deal that was made once upon a time. And all of a sudden, we see this story start just in hyperspeed growing. Because the Israelites that once upon a time were only 70 were now multiplying. Remember this part? So God, in his covenant to Abraham, gives him one command: be fruitful and multiply, right? Like we said, that's a great commandment. That's the first commandment of the Bible. Be fruitful and multiply. Gives it to Adam and Eve, gives it to a number of people, gives it to Abraham. And now we see in Joseph, or after Joseph's life, 400 years later, the Israelites have been obedient to that command while living in Egypt, and they're growing. And they're now 4 to 6 million strong. And Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh who knew nothing about Joseph, is threatened by their growth, by their rapid growth. And he looks around, he's like, what are we going to do? What does he do? He enslaves them. Okay, he puts them in chains. He forces them to build bricks. He makes them take those bricks and build buildings. And we talked about the depths of this slavery last week, what this looked like. It was horrendous. Men were watching their wives get arrested. They were watching their children be shackled and taken off to God knows where. They were in these concentration camps. It was terrible. All of this stuff was happening. And then in our story today, as though everything that had happened to the Jewish people up to this point was not enough, it gets kicked up a tremendous amount, where Pharaoh it feels like he loses his mind and he goes completely sadistic in all of this. And the pivot point in the story is Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. I'm going to read this, then we're going to backtrack. Exodus 2:10. When the child grew older, so the child being Moses, when Moses grew older, Moses' mother, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. So what we're going to see in this story, we're going to backtrack and come back to this in just a moment. Number one, Moses, that's not his Jewish name. That's his Egyptian name, and it stuck. So for whatever reason, Pharaoh's daughter got to name him. And so we get here because of everything that I just said, but now we're at this pivot point in the story where Pharaoh has enslaved 4 to 6 million Jews. All of these Jewish people are now enslaved to him, and he's threatened. He's looking around, he's threatened by how quickly they're growing, and he does something astronomically sadistic. And it echoes, actually, it just kind of foreshadows what's going to happen when Jesus is born, and King Herod does something very similar. If you remember the story in Luke's gospel, we see that Herod is threatened because a new king of Israel has been born. Since the wise men, all of this stuff happens, and ultimately he makes an edict that any baby boy 2 years old or younger must be killed because he's threatened by this potential king. And Jesus, because of a dream, escapes with his parents into Egypt. Just coming full circle. But here what's happening in the Old Testament, this illustrative part of the Old Testament, is this Pharaoh is so antsy about these Jewish people that he makes an edict that whenever a baby is born in the Jewish camp, okay, he's going to have they're all going to have birth with midwives. These Hebrew midwives are going to help the women give birth. As they give birth, if the woman gives birth to a daughter, to a little girl, the girl's safe. Everything's cool. She can live a happy life. Happy life. She can grow up as a slave. But she can live. But the edict is, if a baby boy is born, you are to kill that baby boy on the spot. Have you ever caught how they were supposed to kill this baby boy? It's horrible. Throw him in the Nile River. That's not a cool way to die, okay? So this is what's going on. Now let's look at this. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 17 through 20, this is how the midwives, and these are Hebrew midwives, this is how they responded to the edict. The midwives feared God and did not do as the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt, Pharaoh himself, called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And why have you let those male children live? And the midwife said, and this is some serious smack talk. These ladies had game. This is impressive. Listen to what this is the king of the world at this point, okay? This is what the midwife said. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Do you understand what they're saying? Hebrew women are tough. They're hardcore. There's words I could use. We're in church. They're tough, okay? And you Egyptian women, you're kind of soft, okay? But our women are tougher than your women. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Now, we're not going to see it here, but their names are actually listed. They're heroes. There's some heroes in this story. So how brave are these women? Like, have you ever read this and gone, man, that was some bravery, what these women did? I think it's shocking. I think it's absolutely shocking what they did. Now, full transparency. So I don't ever want to hype something up to be more than it is. Full transparency. Infanticide was a major deal. It was common in that era. And what I mean by let's just kill the babies, it wasn't a big deal. Now, we might say not much has changed, right? We could say something very similar even today with our value of life and abortion in our world today. But this isn't that sermon. But this is an interesting connection that we see here. But I just want to show you, that the value of babies' lives was not very high at this current time. Once upon a time, there was an Egyptian, this is a true story, not some kind of fable I'm making up. Archaeologists have found a letter that an Egyptian had written to his wife. It's an Egyptian businessman. He's going on a road trip to Rome. That can't be good, right? Like he's going to be gone for months. Ladies, how you doing if your husband's on the road to Rome and you have no idea what's going on? The other part of this is this man. His name's Hilarion. Hilarion is going to Rome, and while he's going to Rome, his wife is back home in Egypt, and she's pregnant. So once he gets to Rome, he wants to send her a love card, a Valentine's Day card, if you will. So on this Hallmark card, this is what he writes to his pregnant wife back at home doing the whole, hey, I'm pregnant delivery thing on her own. Here's Hilarion's work, and I can't believe Hallmark didn't write this card. This is what it says. Good luck to you. So random. Good luck, my fine lady, okay? If good luck to you, you have a child. If it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, expose it. In other words, kill it. Ladies, what does that do for your heart? Right? You're already pregnant. You're already hormonal. Your husband has left. You have no support, but he sends you this sweet telegram. Baby, sweetheart, I miss you more than life itself. You're the best. You're so pretty. I bet you every day when you get bigger and bigger, I bet you're glowing and radiant. You're beautiful. By the way, if we have a child and it's a girl, kill her. I mean, how horrible is this? But it's just to show us that this was the norm of the day. This was standard operating procedure. Now, in our culture, in our day, maybe not our culture, but our day and age, this is something that we're at least familiar with, right? Haven't we seen this in China? Where you've got population overgrowth in the entire country, so to limit that, they put cap on how many children you're allowed to have. Now, what would happen in China? What would often happen in China? If you gave birth, if you were only allowed one child and you gave birth to a little girl, you would kill the little girl. Why? Because you wanted a son. Why did you want a son? Let's think about this. Why would you want a son? To carry on your name, right? This would, your legacy, your family, everything in that. If you have a girl, that girl's going to be blended into a new culture. In a couple months, Haley's going to get a new name. She's still going to be my twin, but she's going to have a new name, okay? So you get blended in that. So we get rid of the girls to keep our name alive. So they would get rid of the girls, keep the boys. But in this particular situation, here in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, Pharaoh issues the edict that the boys must die. The boys must die. Why is that? Why is that? Here's why. The Hebrew women, think about how easy this would be. The Hebrew women could easily be assimilated into the Egyptian population. What I mean by that, if the women were alive, they could go marry Egyptian men. And the Egyptian name would continue. The Egyptian culture would continue. And there's also this thing called polygamy, where husbands were allowed to have many wives. So I might have 4 Egyptian wives, but I have 1 Hebrew wife. My DNA, my culture, my lineage is not too tainted. So what he was doing, what Pharaoh was doing, is he's shutting off the bloodline, and he's going to incorporate Israel into Egyptian culture. Now, he's also understanding that if boys grow up, they're also probably likely to become soldiers, and they could be a threat to me. So there's a number of things going on here. But if a boy is born, it's much harder to integrate him into Egyptian culture. If he marries an Egyptian girl, that Egyptian girl would take his Hebrew name, and she would become Hebrew. So let's get rid of the boys. One thing I didn't even think about till last night, this is with Jesus and with Moses. Do you ever, I've never thought of this, and maybe you have. If you have, why didn't you tell me? Because this is really cool. Well, it's not cool, it's horribly wicked. But Jesus grew up. I wonder what the ratio of boys to girls was when Jesus grew up in an era where every 2-year-old boy and under was killed because of him. So there's probably a lot of girls than just Jesus, right? And then Moses has the same thing going on. All these baby boys are disposed of. And this set the stage for one of the most creative cases of civil disobedience I've ever heard about. Exodus chapter 2, let's get to it. Exodus chapter 2, this is what it says. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife another Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, so this is Moses' mom and dad, okay? So she sees that it's a fine child. So he's got all his fingers, got all his toes, great kid. She hid him for 3 months. Ladies and gentlemen, y'all that are parents or aunts or uncles, how easy is it to hide a newborn, right? And by the way, this isn't a shot, this is an encouragement. I'm so glad we have babies in our church. Y'all that have babies, you can't hide them in this auditorium, let alone hide them from Pharaoh, right? How impressive is it that she's hid him for 3 months? Verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, like Moses getting too loud, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes, and she daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank, and his sister, this is Miriam, her name's Miriam, his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to her brother. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at a river while her young women walked beside the river. So I'm wondering what the women are doing. Are they shooing away the crocodiles? Like they're there. So it's Pharaoh's daughter taking a bath while her entourage is with her. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister, Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. So this is Moses' mom being called upon to breastfeed Moses. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. I'm going to pay you. I'm going to pay you to take care of your own child." That's pretty awesome. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's first talk about these characters. Let's talk about the mom in the story. I don't know what happened to dad. I don't know where Moses' dad is, but what would you do? Seriously, think about this. What would you do if the leader of the entire world, we're not just talking about any leader, we're talking about Pharaoh, like Pharaoh, okay? Really big honcho in world politics. He can do whatever he wants. What would you do if the leader of the entire world made an edict that should you give birth to a boy, that boy was to be instantly killed? What would you do? Now, parents, or everybody in here, your chests are getting big. You're like, no way they're touching my boy, right? You're going to have to go through dad. You're going to have to go through mom. You're going to have to go through auntie, uncle. You're going to have to go through somebody to get this boy. And I get it. On the surface, you sound tough. You really do. But realize this. If you don't give up that baby boy and you are caught, not only is that baby boy going to die, but you are going to die. And before you're dead, what's going to happen to you? You are going to be tortured and made an example of to make sure that other mothers and fathers don't do the same thing. So inevitably, no matter what choice you make, the baby's dead. And you are too. So before you get brave and you're like, I would never do that, realize what kind of position she was in. And also understand that this was a common cultural practice. Like, this is what they did. As evil as this is what they did. What a horrible spot for Moses' mom to be in. But she was crafty, wasn't she? She was incredibly crafty. Think about what she does. She puts this baby into a basket, kind of this cradle boat, okay? I remember one Sunday school when I was a kid, we made baskets like this. This is weird. That's a really weird Sunday school. Y'all, let me know if Pastor Laura ever has you guys make death baskets for babies to be thrown in the Nile. That's weird. It's just, this is what we did. But she makes a basket for him, and she covers it with pitch made of papyrus reeds, and she softly lays the baby in it, and then puts him into the banks of the Nile River. I'm not even kidding. We covered this when I was a kid in Sunday school, and this was the story that haunted me. It's like, first of all, that baby, oh my gosh. Fortunately, he's so young, he didn't realize what's going on. But even at that age, my heart was thinking about that mom. How horrible must that have been? Like, think about it. When your best option, literally your only option to save your son's life is to put him in a basket and send him on down the river. And by the way, it's not just any river, is it? It's the Nile River, which is loaded with crocodiles, right? So when the other Hebrew women would throw their boys into, because I was talking to Melanie about this last night, I'm trying to figure this all out, and I don't really want to know because it's horrible. But I was thinking through this, I'm thinking, ooh, it's kind of gross that Pharaoh's daughter is bathing in the water where all these babies, right? And Melanie's like, Rob, I bet they didn't last long in the water because of the this is the horror of this story. So Moses' mom's best option was, let's put him in a box, send him down the river, and hope for the best. That was her best option. And she wasn't just putting him in a basket, sending him down the river. This is the thing I want you to see this morning. And I didn't think this way growing up. I certainly didn't think this way for a while. Is it possible that Moses' mom did this intentionally? Like she knew the schedule of Pharaoh's daughter, her bathing schedule. Like she probably often came down there at a certain time. And so she waited until Pharaoh's daughter. It wasn't just like, oh, look at the coincidence that Pharaoh's daughter was here bathing. She waited. This was strategic. This was very much a plan in her mind. Moses' mother was leaning into the hope that there might be just one woman of all these women that were there that would have a mother's heart, someone with mercy for her baby, who would discover the baby and spare his life. And again, this is just the best case scenario. Best case scenario, you throw him in a river, somebody spares him. But who is that somebody? Even if he gets saved and rescued, who is that somebody? It's the daughter of the guy who made the edict to kill all these babies. So best case scenario, your son is going to be raised by the enemy. Oh my gosh, right? Think about the person you just can't stand the most. It might be somebody pretty close to you. But think about that person going, my best option is to give my brand new baby to that person and not be part of their life. That's the guts of this woman. Now, fortunately, by God's providence, and I want you to get familiar with that term, by God's providence, her plan works. Not only were the Egyptian women bathing in the Nile at the exact time, but Pharaoh's daughter was there. And apparently she takes one look at this cute little baby and her heart goes out to him. I mean, whose heart doesn't melt when they see a brand new baby? Right? It's when they're 2 or 3 when we start questioning things, right? But as babies, we're like, oh, look at how precious that person is. What did she notice right away, ladies and gentlemen? What did she notice? She noticed he was Hebrew. She noticed he was a Jewish. But now there's a couple reasons for that. And I'm not trying to be weird, okay? Melanie told me I couldn't do jokes here, so I'm just going to stick with the facts, Jack. But there are some good jokes here. I just want you to know there's some good material that's being left out right now, okay? So she knew he was Hebrew, number one, because Egyptian moms probably weren't throwing their babies into the Nile River. The edict was that the Jewish ladies had to do that. Secondly, when she opens it up, he's adorable, he's cute, and what else is he probably? He's circumcised, okay? Now think about that years in his future, when he's being raised in Pharaoh's house and nobody else is. Locker room in middle school, probably pretty rough for Mr. Moses. Don't laugh because I get in trouble. Don't laugh, it's not jokes, it is kind of funny. And out pops Moses' big sister. She's been following all along. Pharaoh's like, oh, I want to take care of this child. And Miriam, his sister, shows up and says, can I go get a wet nurse for you? You haven't been pregnant. You can't supply food for him. Can I go get a wet nurse? And Pharaoh's daughter's like, great idea, go get a wet nurse. And so the wet nurse is Moses' own mother. Now, here's the thing. When you read this story, you're like, okay, they're just going to breastfeed him when he's done. They're going to hand him back. This isn't what happened. What was custom back then is the wet nurse would take care of this child until this child was at least 5 years old. Anywhere from 5 to 8 years old, this child would live with that wet nurse and then be handed over to the adoptive parent. Think about the ramifications of that, ladies and gentlemen. For 5 years, Moses grew up with his people. So you guys can remember, what's your furthest memory in your life? I can remember being 4 and 5 years old. I don't remember everything, but I remember it. So from an early age, it was established in Moses, you are a Hebrew. You are Jewish. This is who you are. This is your identity. So when he got handed back over to Pharaoh's daughter, even though he would be raised in the palace and raised under the one who was killing his people and enslaving his people, he knew who he was. So later on in the story, when he comes up against the Egyptian and the Israeli fighting each other, he's got an identity conflict. Who am I in this? And we'll get to that. Not today, but we will get to that. So Moses' family was going to raise him for the first 5 to 8 years of his life. Think about this, why it's so important. Because God was doing something behind the scenes in a situation that didn't make any sense at all. And I've kind of let the cat out of the bag over the weeks. If Moses had not been raised by his own family in these first 5 years of his life, he never could have been a leader of the Israelites later on because he wouldn't have understood his racial identity. Once he's moved into Pharaoh's house, it was all out Egyptian training from that point forward for Moses. Had this happened to him from birth, if he started at birth as an Egyptian, he never would have recognized or understood who he truly was. Because in Pharaoh's house, what would happen? He would receive the best training, he'd get the best education, skills, military prowess. Ultimately, he'd be trained to become a great leader. And think about this. None of that would have happened if Moses grew up in the house of a slave. If he just remained a Jew, number one, he would have ended up in the Nile River dead. But God, through his providence, this is the craziest part to me. God, through his providence, didn't just spare Moses' life. I bet God, through his providence, kind of created the edict that started so a whole plan could be set into motion that God's people would be saved through this little boy who becomes a man. It's crazy when you start thinking about this. And if Moses had been raised Jewish, he would have been pushed away from the corridors of power in Egypt. Hebrews weren't allowed into the educational systems or institutions. They had no access to learning or education. He could never have been the deliverer of his people, leader of his people, unless everything played out exactly the way it did. Is that luck? Is the book of Exodus a story of luck? I can't believe that. Like God's in heaven going, thank you, Pharaoh. You hooked a brother up. I don't know what I would have done without you. That's not the case at all. What does this mean for us today? And let me end with this. What does it mean to us? As we hear this story of Moses, what does it mean to us? Some of you, right now, we prayed for some of you guys at the beginning of this. Some of you are in a season where nothing in your life is going your way. Ever been there? You're just Eeyore. It's like nothing is going my way. You feel like everything is stacked against you, like you're doing the right things, you're trying to honor God, but life keeps hitting you and slapping you in the face. Maybe it's a job loss, a broken relationship, financial ruin, health scare, or just the weight of uncertainty in your life. But here's what we see in Exodus 2 when we slow down. We're like, this is more than just a baby and some water. What we see is God is always, ladies and gentlemen, at work behind the scenes, doing things that we can't see. And we will one day, but we don't see them right now. What's really interesting to me is for those of you guys that were with us in 2023 when we went through the book of Revelation, at its heart, what was the book of Revelation all about? Peeling back the curtain so we can see what is actually true. That we can see that God's not MIA. He's not missing in action. God is present in his church. You just can't see everything that's happening. And I'm like, that's exactly what's going on in Exodus. And then I started thinking, I'm like, that's exactly what happens in Genesis. And that's exactly what happens in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Like every book of the Bible is a story encouraging us as followers of Jesus Christ. Listen, life's going to be hard. Trust me, I'm working behind the scenes. There's always something going on that you don't see. It's bigger, and I'm calling you to faith. I'm calling you to trust, and that's what's happening. So Moses' mother couldn't have known exactly how things would turn out. When she placed him in that basket, she wasn't given a blueprint on how Pharaoh's daughter would find him. I wish I could unpack this more. The foreshadowing of Moses' story to Jesus' story is insane. Here's another one. okay? Moses' mom doing everything in her power to help her boy. And then later on in the New Testament, we see Mary at the foot of the cross with Jesus. Both of these women tormented. The difference, and I'm not saying Mary had it easy, not saying it at all, but Mary knew what was going on. At least the angel came to Mary and said, hey, this is what's going to happen. Now, it's going to be horrible, but trust me, it's for the good. Moses' mom didn't even have that. She's just put him in a basket going, man, I hope God is in this. I hope God figures out a way to take care of this. And God did what only God could do. Just like the story of Joseph in Genesis, he took a dire, impossible situation and he turned it into a divine setup for his greater plan. What does it mean for you? 3 things, 3 quick things. Number 1, God's providence is always at work, even when you don't understand it. Praise God. He's not twiddling his thumbs trying to figure out. He's not impulsive. He's going, oh gosh, man, that's a doozy. I don't know what I'm going to do. No, God's in control. He's not shaken. He's not confused. He's not confounded in any manner. Now, in our lives, we love those big moments. In Exodus, we love those stories, the big stories where it's obviously God, right? The Red Sea. Oh, wow, God parted the Red Sea. He feeds them manna from heaven. He provides a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Those are big moments. That's God. But more often than not, God is working through the smaller details, right? He's working in the small, hidden details of our lives, things that often seem random or even unfair at the time. And Moses' survival was not about luck at all. It wasn't about a coincidence that Pharaoh's daughter was there at the exact same time, or that she had a heart of compassion, or that Miriam was brave enough to step forward. Everything in this story was orchestrated by Maestro, by our God. And the same is true for your life. You may not see it now, and you might not see it till heaven, but one day you will see it, that every piece of your life is intentional. There's no wasted good, there's no wasted bad, because the bad will be leveraged and used for good. 100% of the time. Romans 8 says that, Genesis 50 says that. You may not see it now, but God is writing truly a story bigger than you can ever understand, which brings us to the second point. Not only is God's providence always at work in your life, but your hardships, your difficulties, your struggles may be preparation for something greater. So Moses was being set up for something far beyond what his mother could have imagined. She wasn't thinking, hey, this is going to be the redeemer of our people. She's just trying to get him to be alive tomorrow. He was trained in Pharaoh's house so that he could one day stand before Pharaoh as God's representative. What if, ladies and gentlemen, what if your trials, what if the things you're going through right now are literally preparing you for what he has next for you? Now, in that, I don't want to come out here and say God's got some mammoth plan where you're going to get this office or you're going to get this job, you're going to be this. I'm not saying that. What if all of it is so God could get your heart? What if he cares about all of it because at the core of everything you are, he wants your heart? How far are you willing to let God go with your life to get your heart? And that's what's going on here. So what if the hardships of your life are being used and leveraged, and God's like, yeah, I'm cool with this. It's not out of my control. I'm totally okay with this because I see a bigger picture that you don't see yet. One day you will, but I'm in control. So his providence is at work. Our hardships are preparing us for something greater, even if it's just our heart. And then finally, faith means moving forward when you don't have all the answers. So Moses' mother didn't sit back and just wait. It wasn't a passive faith. She stepped out. She made decisions. She trusted God even when the future was unclear. So let's zoom out. Let's zoom out for a minute. The story we find in Exodus 2, we're going to go from here into Moses killing a guy into the burning bush. There's some exciting stuff about to happen in Exodus 2 and 3. But Exodus 2 is a story of utter despair, terrible despair. It's a story of a mom who has to make the hardest choice of her life. It's a story of slavery, oppression, genocide. And if we stop there, look, if the story ended in Exodus 2, doesn't it seem like the devil won? Like Exodus 2, let's cut it off. All these babies are dying. The devil has won. But you and I, thousands of years later, we have the whole picture. We have 40 chapters of Exodus, not just 2. And we realize it's actually the story of God's faithfulness, God's providence, and God's redemption. God was never absent in Moses' story. He wasn't indifferent. Instead, what he was doing was he was positioning and maneuvering Moses and all the pieces on the puzzle to be the leader he would be to one day draw Israel out of slavery. And if that's how God works, through the unseen, through the pain, through the suffering, through the waiting, then you and I can trust that he's doing the exact same thing in our lives right now. So my challenge for you today, what if you believed? What if you truly believed that even when nothing is going your way, that God is still moving, that God is using every moment of your life for your good and for his glory? What if the very thing that you're frustrated with this morning is the very thing that God is using in you to prepare you for tomorrow? So the question should never be, God, are you working? God, are you doing anything? That should never be your question. The Bible answers that. There's certain things you don't have to pray about because it says it in the Bible. God, are you working? You never have to ask that because the answer is always yes. The question you should ask is, will I trust him even when I can't see what he's working on? Will I trust him? Will I have faith in him? Let's be a people who don't just look at the chaos around us, but trust that behind the scenes, God is writing a story the story is already written. He's playing it out. It's far bigger than anything we can imagine. And just like he did with Moses, he will deliver us in his perfect timing. And we'll talk about this next week, that his timing is rarely the same as ours. That's an amen, right? Yeah. So we'll talk, there I go again, getting ahead of myself. So we'll talk about that next week. Would you stand? I know the beginning of this series has been very similar. Every week it's about suffering, and God working behind the scenes. I think that's intentional, because that's the story of our lives so often in this broken world, is that we go through pain and we go through stuff and we're like, where's God? And God's just affirming, trust me. Those who hold fast to me will be rewarded. And so that's the encouragement for us this morning. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you're faithful. You're faithful to your covenant. You're faithful to your people, that you will never break covenant with us. Even when we do our best to break that covenant with you, you're faithful to us, and we're so grateful. So God, I pray for every man and woman here today, even the kids, Lord. They're going through stuff that is beyond their capacity. They don't know what to do with it. They're losing sleep over it. They're struggling. God, I pray in all of it that you would just affirm their faith, that you would use this as a moment to allow their roots in you to go deeper, to make them more stable, more sturdy, that you would do something in our heart. May we learn the lessons that you're teaching us. May we learn them quickly. God, grow our faith, develop our faith. May we be stronger in you than we ever have. God, I pray if it's your will that you would lead us through these situations as quickly as possible, that you would restore what's been broken or stolen. And God, you would redeem all these things. We know you one day will. We know that. But God, we thank you for a glimpse into heaven today. We thank you for a glimpse into your plan, knowing that you never leave us, you never forsake us. You're a good God. So God, in all of these areas of our life that we're struggling with, may we apply this week. It's in Christ's name I pray.